The air inside the Rayburn House office building hearing room was stale, recycled, and thick with the specific kind of tension that only exists when a predator realizes he is no longer the hunter, but the prey. It was a sterile coliseum of mahogany and marble, illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving glare of CSBN floodlights that bleached the color out of everything they touched. Congressman Seth Moulton sat perfectly still. His posture was not the practiced stiffness of a politician trying to look important. It was the ingrained, muscle memory rigidity of a Marine who had spent years waiting in the silence before the breach. His hands rested on the dossier in front of him, fingers intertwined, devoid of the nervous twitching that plagued so many of his colleagues. He didn't need to wave his arms to command attention. He possessed the quiet lethality of a man who knew exactly where the kill shot was, and he had been waiting patiently for the target to walk into his crosshairs. Across the expanse of the witness table sat Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. To the untrained eye, Hegseth looked the part. He was a masterpiece of political casting. The suit was cut to perfection, draping over broad shoulders that had been meticulously maintained for television cameras rather than combat loads. His hair was a helmet of spray, immobile and defiant. He sat with the expansive confidence of a man accustomed to the friendly banter of a morning show couch, where questions were softballs and the audience was always on his side. But this wasn't a Fox News studio. There was no teleprompter to save him, and the man staring at him from the dais wasn't a co-host paid to nod in agreement. Moulton watched Hegseth scan the room. He saw the secretary's eyes darting a microscopic flicker of assessment, assessing the cameras, assessing the lighting, assessing the angles. He's still performing, Moulton thought, a cold realization settling in his gut. He thinks this is about sound bites. He thinks this is about who can shout the loudest or who has the best clip for Twitter tonight. Moulton glanced down at the paper before him. It wasn't a speech. It was a trap built not on rhetoric, but on the cold, hard steel of military regulation. The kind of regulations that kept men alive in the mud of Iraq. The kind of regulations that Hegseth seemed to view as optional suggestions for the elite. The room buzzed with the low murmur of aides, shuffling papers, and the clicking of camera shutters, a chaotic symphony that usually distracted witnesses. But Moulton tuned it out. He focused entirely on the man in the witness chair. He remembered what it felt like to hold a rifle, to know that a single mistake, a single loose word, a single breach of protocol could mean a flag-draped coffin for a kid from Ohio or Alabama. That weight never left him. It sat on his chest every time he walked into this building. And now, looking at Hegseth, he saw a man who wore the uniform's aesthetic without carrying its burden. Hegseth was smiling, a tight, practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. He was leaning back, projecting an air of casual dominance, chatting with an aide who whispered something in his ear. He looked like a CEO at a board meeting he had already rigged. Enjoy the smile while you can, Pete, Moulton thought, his own face an unreadable mask of stone. The chairman banged the gavel, a sharp crack that silenced the murmurs. The sound hung in the air, echoing off the high ceilings. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton. The chairman's voice droned, indifferent to the violence that was about to unfold. Moulton didn't speak immediately. He let the silence stretch. He let it expand until it became uncomfortable, forcing Hegseth to shift slightly in his chair, to adjust his cufflinks, to break his composed facade for just a fraction of a second. Silence was a weapon, and Moulton wielded it with surgical precision. When he finally spoke, his voice was deceptively low. It wasn't a shout. It was a growl wrapped in velvet. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Moulton said, his eyes never leaving Hegseth's face. He didn't look at his notes. He didn't need to. He knew the facts. He knew the betrayal. "Secretary," Moulton began, the title sounding less like an honorific and more like an accusation. "I'd like to clarify a few important details for the record." Hegseth nodded, a benevolent gesture, as if granting a favor. He leaned into the microphone, ready to pivot, ready to spin. He was prepared for a fight about policy, about budgets, about the culture wars that he loved to wage. He was ready to talk about wokeness in the military. He was ready to talk about recruitment numbers. But Moulton wasn't interested in the culture war. He was interested in the chain of command. When you texted the launch time for F-18s going into combat over enemy territory, Moulton continued, his voice hardening, each word dropping like a hammer. Facing anti-aircraft missiles on an unclassified signal chat. Did that launch time come from Central Command? Yes or no? The room seemed to drop in temperature. The aides behind Hegseth froze. The scratching of pens stopped. This was the ambush. Moulton watched the realization hit Hegseth. It wasn't a wave. It was a ripple. A slight tightening of a jaw. A blink that lasted a millisecond too long. The TV armor cracked. Hegseth had expected a speech about diversity or funding. He hadn't expected a forensic audit of his operational security. Signal, the app, the convenience of the modern age, the bane of intelligence officers everywhere. Moulton knew exactly what that meant. F-18s, launch times. These weren't abstract numbers. These were pilots. Human beings strapped into millions of dollars of aluminum and high explosives, hurtling towards enemy air defenses. Knowing when they launched was knowing when they would arrive. It was the difference between surprise and a slaughter. And the Secretary of Defense, the man charged with their protection, had allegedly treated this information with the casualness of a teenager planning a weekend party. Hegseth's eyes shifted to the side, looking for an exit ramp. He licked his lips. The confident smile was gone, replaced by a look of calculated confusion. Hegseth started, the polished orator suddenly stumbling. I know what you're referring to, and there were no. He trailed off. He was stalling. His brain was frantically searching for the talking point, the spin, the deflection. But there is no spin for operational security. It is binary. It is secure, or it is compromised. Did it? Moulton cut him off, refusing to let him find his footing. He leaned forward, his body language aggressive, dominant. It's a very simple question. Did it come from Central Command? Hegseth shifted again. He looked annoyed now, the annoyance of a man who believes he shouldn't be questioned by his lessers. Well, in this committee, Hegseth began, his tone patronizing, no way in which I communicate or what I communicate on a successful strike is something that I would share. Moulton felt a surge of cold anger. A successful strike, as if the outcome justified the negligence. As if driving drunk was acceptable as long as you didn't crash the car this time. So, you can't even identify the combatant command under which this operation occurred. Moulton pressed, his voice dripping with incredulity. He was peeling back the layers of incompetence, exposing the hollow core beneath the suit. Well, everybody knows. Hegseth waved a hand dismissively, trying to laugh it off, trying to bring the room into his conspiracy of casualness. Everybody knows the Central Command. Okay, Moulton snapped, locking the trap shut. So, everyone knows the Central Command. So, when Central Command sent you this information, did they send it on a classified system or an unclassified system? This was the kill zone. Moulton knew the answer. Every person in that room who had ever held a security clearance knew the answer. Central Command does not text launch times on unclassified iPhones. They use SIPRnet. They use secure terminals. They use the infrastructure of secrets that cost billions of dollars and thousands of lives to build. Hegseth looked trapped. He knew that if he admitted it came from a classified system, he was admitting to a crime, moving classified data to an unclassified device. If he said it wasn't classified, he was lying to Congress. So he did what politicians do. He tried to change reality. Well, as you know, having served yourself, Hegseth said, trying to invoke the brotherhood of service, tried to use Moulton's own Marine background as a shield. It was a fatal miscalculation. Moulton wasn't his brother in this. Moulton was his judge. Any way that the Secretary of Defense communicates or provides information in and of itself is classified, not to be discussed. Moulton stared at him. The audacity was breathtaking. Hegseth was effectively claiming that he was a walking, talking SCGF, sensitive compartmented information facility, that the rules of classification didn't apply to the documents, but were magically transmuted by his touch. It was the logic of a king, not a public servant. He actually believes it, Moulton realized. He believes he is above the system. So what was the classification marking of the launch time when it was sent to you? Moulton fired back, ignoring the metaphysical nonsense Hegseth had just spouted. He was dragging the secretary back to the hard, cold ground of regulations. Because DoD regulations require information on classified systems to be marked. What was the classification mark time? Hegseth stammered, repeating the words as if they were a foreign language. He was losing control of the narrative. The clip was going to be bad, and he knew it. Yeah, what was the classification marking? Moulton repeated, relentless. He could see the sweat starting to form on Hegseth's upper lip, despite the frigid air conditioning. Because Hegseth paused, his eyes narrowing. He decided to attack. Again, classifications of any information in an ongoing operation that was successful are not things that would be disclosed in a public forum. It was a weak parry, a desperate attempt to hide behind national security to protect his own personal security. You can very well disclose whether or not it was classified. Moulton's voice rose slightly, powered by the sheer absurdity of the answer. It's not classified to disclose whether or not it was classified. The absurdity hung in the air. Moulton looked around the room briefly, inviting the audience to witness the farce. It was like asking a driver if the light was red and having them answer that the destination was beautiful. And in fact, Moulton continued, driving the point home. OD regulations state that any classified information has to be labeled with its classification. Was it classified secret or top secret? Moulton waited. He watched the gears turning in Hegseth's head. The secretary was cornered. He couldn't say secret because he had texted it. He couldn't say unclassified because that would mean Central Command was running war operations on open lines. Hegseth smiled again, that tight, condescending smile a man who has run out of arguments but refuses to concede. What's not classified, Hegseth drawled, leaning back, trying to regain his alpha posture, is that it was an incredibly successful mission against the Houthis. There it was. The pivot. The distraction. Look at the fireworks. Don't look at the man lighting matches in the powder keg. Moulton didn't blink. He didn't smile. He looked at Hegseth with the cold, pitiable gaze of a professional looking at an amateur who was playing with live grenades. Okay, so it was classified. Moulton deduced, his voice flat and final. He wasn't asking anymore. He was stating facts for the record. The first skirmish was over. Moulton had drawn blood. He had exposed the carelessness. Now, he was going to expose the hypocrisy. He took a breath, glancing at the next section of his notes. The word accountability was written there in bold, black ink. It stared up at him, demanding to be heard. Moulton prepared to pivot. If Hegseth thought the questions about Signal were technical and annoying, he was about to find out that the questions about his own integrity were going to be devastating. The room was no longer just a hearing. It was a courtroom, and the character of the Secretary of Defense was on trial. The silence in the hearing room was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a physical weight pressing down on the chest of everyone present. The air conditioning hummed a low, monotonous drone, a stark contrast to the erratic rhythm of Pete Hegseth's breathing. He was trying to hide it, trying to maintain the slow, measured inhalation of a man in control. But Seth Moulton could see the truth. He could see it in the slight flare of the secretary's nostrils, the way his hand hovered over the water glass without picking it up. Moulton didn't look away. He didn't blink. He was dissecting the man across from him, layer by layer. "Are you asserting," Moulton asked, his voice cutting through the stale air like a scalpel, "are you trying to say that the information was unclassified?" It was a binary trap. If Hegseth said yes, he was claiming Central Command. The nerve center of American military power in the Middle East was incompetent enough to send war plans over open lines. If he said no, he was admitting to a felony. Hegseth shifted in his seat. The leather creaked, a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the quiet room. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes darted to the ceiling, then back to Moulton. "I'm not trying to say that's what I thought," Hegseth stammered, the words tumbling out in a disorganized heap. "You're not saying that." He was arguing with himself now. The polished pundit was gone, replaced by a man realizing that the teleprompter had gone black. Moulton watched the internal struggle. It was fascinating in a grim way. Hegseth was used to debates where he could shout over the opponent, where the loudest voice won. But here, under oath, surrounded by the rigid architecture of the law, volume didn't matter. Precision did. So, Moulton continued, relentlessly connecting the dots that Hegseth was desperately trying to scatter. You took classified information from Central Command that had a classification marking on it, because that's what's required by DoD regulations, and you put it on an unclassified system. The sentence hung in the air. It wasn't a question anymore. It was an indictment. Moulton let the gravity of the statement sink in. He thought about the young lance corporals he had commanded in Iraq. He thought about the intelligence analysts buried in windowless bunkers in Virginia. People who would lose their careers, their clearances, and potentially their freedom if they did a fraction of what the Secretary of Defense had just admitted to doing. The double standard wasn't just unfair, it was corrosive. It ate away at the very foundation of military discipline. If the man at the top didn't follow the rules, why should anyone else? So, we're going to get a report in a few days, Moulton said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming softer, more dangerous. He leaned forward, encroaching on Hegseth's psychological space. From a DoD Inspector General. At the mention of the Inspector General, a flicker of genuine fear crossed Hegseth's face. The IG wasn't a politician. The IG wasn't a talk show host. The IG was an auditor, a creature of facts and statutes. Politicians could be charmed. Auditors could only be satisfied with evidence. And if the DoD Inspector General finds what is pretty obvious both to you smiling there in the witness seat and to all of us up here, Moulton continued, calling out the defense mechanism directly. He pointed a finger, not accusingly, but descriptively, that the information was in fact classified. Do you plan to take any accountability for that? Hegseth's smile faltered. It had been his shield, his way of saying this is all a game. But Moulton had just shattered the fourth wall. He had acknowledged the smile, stripping it of its power. As I pointed out at the time, Hegseth began, retreating to his prepared lines. He was like a soldier falling back to a trench that had already been overrun. You said that accountability is back, Moulton interrupted. He didn't shout. He just placed the words on the table like a loaded gun. Does that not apply to you? This was the heart of the matter. This was why they were here. It wasn't just about a text message. It was about the soul of the institution. Hegseth had built his brand on being the tough guy, the cleaner, the man who would fire the woke generals and restore warrior culture. But true warrior culture wasn't about beards and tattoos. It was about owning your mistakes. Hegseth stiffened. The attack on his brand seemed to sting more than the attack on his legal standing. As I said at the time, Congressman Hegseth said, his voice taking on a robotic cadence. There were no names, targets, locations, units, routes, sources, methods, no classified information. Moulton resisted the urge to shake his head. It was the amateur's defense. I didn't give away the address, so I didn't endanger the house. But in modern warfare, time is a location. Time is a coordinate. If the enemy knows the F-18's launch at 1400 hours, they don't need to know the route. They just need to turn on their radar at 1405. Okay, Moulton said, his patience wearing thin. So, if it comes back that it is classified, will you take accountability or not? He was offering Hegseth a lifeline, a chance to say, if I was wrong, I will accept the consequences. It was the honorable answer. It was the officer's answer. But Hegseth didn't take it. Instead, he threw smoke. We've already established, you've already admitted that it was classified because everything you get from Syncom is classified. Hegseth shot back, trying to flip the script, try to confuse the record. You just explained that to me. That's how you justify not answering the question. Moulton stared at him, genuinely baffled by the convoluted logic. Hegseth was twisting words into a pretzel, trying to choke the truth with semantics. Not what I said, Moulton corrected sharply. I didn't confirm any classification. Okay, so if it is, Hegseth interrupted, talking over him, his voice rising in pitch. What I know is that everything I share, everything I talk about, Mr. Secretary, does accountability apply to you or not? Moulton's voice boomed, cutting through the noise. He slammed his hand on the table, not hard, but with enough force to rattle the water glasses. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The room froze. The aides stopped whispering. The cameras zoomed in. This was the clip. This was the moment of truth. Is classified whether I talk or not. Hegseth mumbled, still lost in his own circular argument. Does it apply to you or not? Moulton repeated, his eyes locked on Hegseth's. Does what apply to you? Hegseth asked, feigning ignorance. Accountability, Moulton whispered. The word hung there, heavy and accusatory. Hegseth paused. He looked at the cameras, then back to Moulton. He realized he couldn't say no, but his ego wouldn't let him say yes in a way that implied submission. You said accountability is back at the secretary, Moulton reminded him. Hegseth leaned into the microphone, his face tightening into a mask of defiance. He decided to change the battlefield entirely. If he couldn't win on the facts, he would win on emotion. He would wave the bloody shirt. And you know what? Hegseth said, his voice dripping with sudden, manufactured outrage. The Houthis were held accountable for shooting at our... I'm just asking if it applies to successfully, Moulton interjected, refusing to take the bait. I'm not asking about that. Previous administration let our ships get shot at and nothing was done about it. Hegseth shouted now, his voice echoing in the chamber. He was channeling the rally speech, the campaign trail rhetoric. He was trying to bury the specific question about his own conduct under an avalanche of partisan attacks. And thankfully, because of the skill and courage of our troops. Moulton watched the performance with cold detachment. It was pathetic. It was the last refuge of a scoundrel, wrapping oneself in the flag to hide a personal failure. Hegseth was using the bravery of the troops, the very troops he had endangered with his loose operational security, as a human shield against criticism. I'm just asking if accountability applies to you, Moulton said calmly, over the rising tide of Hegseth's bluster. It's a very simple question. We use leadership by... Hegseth sputtered. Of course, unlike you know, I serve at the pleasure of the president like everybody else does, Hegseth finally spat out. There it was. The ultimate deflection. I serve the king, therefore I am immune. Moulton felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just evasion, it was a worldview. Hegseth truly believed that his proximity to the president granted him a special dispensation from the laws of gravity that governed everyone else. It was a dangerous, monarchical view of power that had no place in a democratic republic, let alone in the chain of command. So, it only applies to the president, not to you? Moulton asked, clarifying the absurdity for the record. I serve at the pleasure. Hegseth repeated, like a broken record, clinging to the one phrase that made him feel safe. Moulton sat back in his chair. He had what he needed. He had peeled back the skin and revealed the rod underneath. The accountability that Hegseth preached was a weapon to be used against others, never a mirror to be held up to oneself. But Moulton wasn't done. The digital smoking gun had been fired. Now, he needed to assess the damage. He needed to show the cost of this hubris. You talked about the success of the Houthi operation, Moulton said, shifting gears seamlessly. The prosecutorial fire cooled into an analytical ice. About how much money did it cost? How much money did you spend on missiles shooting at the Houthis? Hegseth blinked. The pivot confused him. He was still pumped up for a fight about honor, and now he was being asked for a spreadsheet. Well, you'd have to compare that with what it cost, Hegseth evaded again. He clearly didn't know the number. Or worse, he knew it and was ashamed of it. I'm just asking how much did it cost? Moulton pressed. Diverted our shipping lanes around, Hegseth mumbled. I'm told it's several $100 million, maybe close to $1 billion. Moulton provided the number, dropping it like a stone into a deep well. The room seemed to shrink. $1 billion. To shoot down cheap drones. While the Secretary of Defense texted launch times on an app you could download from the App Store. The juxtaposition was staggering. High-tech waste meets low-tech negligence. Moulton looked at Hegseth, really looked at him. He saw a man who was drowning in the depth of his own office. A man who thought the job was about speeches and firing people, not about the grinding, detailed, dangerous work of keeping secrets and spending taxpayer money wisely. The digital smoking gun wasn't just the text message. It was the mindset. The text message was just the symptom. The disease was a total lack of seriousness. And as Moulton prepared to move to the next phase of his interrogation, the purge of the generals, he knew that the disease was spreading. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty. It was filled with the ghosts of the standards that used to matter. The phrase hung in the air, echoing off the mahogany paneling like a feudal decree. "I serve at the pleasure of the president." Seth Moulton sat back, his fingers tracing the edge of the paper in front of him. He knew that phrase. Every student of government knew it. It was the constitutional tether that bound the military to civilian control. It was meant to ensure that generals didn't become warlords. But coming from Pete Hegseth's mouth, in this context, it didn't sound like a humble admission of service. It sounded like a claim of immunity. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card played by a man who had just admitted to texting war plans on a civilian app. He thinks the president is a king, Moulton realized, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. And he thinks being the king's favorite courtier puts him above the law. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. To the aides and the press, this was just another hearing. But to Moulton, it was a terrifying glimpse into a fractured chain of command. If the Secretary of Defense believed his authority was personal, derived from the pleasure of one man rather than the statutes of the Constitution, then the entire system of military justice was in peril. A lance corporal in Okinawa didn't serve at the pleasure of the president in the same way. He served under the uniform code of military justice. If he broke the rules, he went to the brig. Hegseth was effectively saying, "The rules are for the little people." Moulton let the silence stretch again, letting the arrogance of Hegseth's statement marinate in the room. He wanted the cameras to capture the smugness, the slight tilt of the chin that said, "You can't touch me." "So it only applies to the president, not to you," Moulton said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He was driving a stake into the ground, marking the spot where the rule of law ended and the rule of man began. Hegseth didn't answer directly. He just repeated the mantra, "I serve at the pleasure," as if the repetition would make the hypocrisy disappear. Moulton shifted gears. He could see that Hegseth was dug in on the accountability issue. The secretary had built a fortress of denial around his own conduct. So, Moulton decided to flank him. If he couldn't shame Hegseth with ethics, he would crush him with math. "You talked about the success of the Houthi operation," Moulton said, glancing at the financial figures in his dossier. The numbers were staggering, astronomical, and they were being burned in the Red Sea at a rate that would make a defense contractor blush. Hegseth perked up. This was his turf. Success was a word he liked. It was a TV word. It looked good on a cheering. About how much money did it cost? Moulton asked, the question landing with a dull thud. How much money did you spend on missile shooting at the Houthis? Hegseth blinked. The confidence wavered. He looked like a student who had memorized the essay portion of the exam, but forgot to study the math section. "Well, you'd have to compare that with what it cost." Hegseth began, his hands waving vaguely in the air, trying to conjure a context that would excuse the expenditure. "I'm just asking how much did it cost?" Moulton interrupted, cutting through the fog. He didn't want philosophy. He wanted a receipt. "Diverted our shipping lanes around," Hegseth mumbled, avoiding the number. "I'm told it's several $100 million, maybe close to $1 billion, Moulton stated. He let the number hang there. $1 billion. The room was silent. $1 billion. For that amount of money, you could rebuild entire cities. You could modernize fleets. You could fix the housing crisis for military families. And Hegseth had spent it playing a game of whack-a-mole with cheap drones in the desert. How many U.S.-flagged commercial ships have transited the Red Sea since your so-called successful operation? Moulton asked. This was the trap. This was the question that stripped away the mission accomplished banner and revealed the empty scaffolding underneath. Hegseth's eyes darted left and right. He looked at his aides, but they were staring at their shoes. They knew the answer. Everyone knew the answer. Well, thankfully, unlike the previous administration, the answer is zero, Hegseth said, triumphantly. Moulton paused, genuinely stunned by the answer. He stared at Hegseth, wondering if the man had simply misspoken or if he was truly that delusional. Thankfully, the answer is zero. Military vessels transit. Hegseth started to correct himself, realizing he had walked into a minefield. No, no, no. Moulton cut in, his voice sharp. I didn't ask about military vessels. I would be the precursor for. How many commercial vessels? Moulton pressed, relentless. It's been several weeks. How many commercial vessels, U.S. flagged, have transited? Would you, Mr. Congressman, put civilian ships? Hegseth tried to turn the question around, tried to make it a moral dilemma. Would you send them into danger? The questions are not to me. They're to you. Moulton snapped. He wasn't going to let Hegseth play the victim. We have responsibly put military. Hegseth tried again. The answer is zero, Moulton said, finishing the sentence for him. I reclaim my time. The reality of that zero crashed into the room. $1 billion spent. Missiles fired. Launch times texted on insecure apps. Success claimed in every press release. And the result? Zero. Not a single U.S. commercial ship could safely pass. The operation was a tactical light show, but a strategic failure. The Houthis had effectively closed the Red Sea to American commerce, and Hegseth was calling it a victory because he got to fire some rockets. It was the perfect encapsulation of the showman archetype. All flash, no substance. $1 billion firework display that achieved absolutely nothing for the actual economy or security of the nation. Moulton felt a wave of exhaustion. It wasn't physical. It was the existential fatigue of watching a serious institution being run by unserious people. But he couldn't stop now. He had exposed the security breach. He had exposed the strategic failure. Now it was time for the final, most painful cut. He looked at Hegseth, who was still bristling, still trying to rearrange his facial features into a look of command. But the cracks were visible. The makeup was melting under the lights. Moulton turned the page of his notebook. He didn't look at the notes. He knew this part by heart. This was the part that angered him the most. This was the part about the men and women who had dedicated their lives to the uniform, only to be discarded like used tissues because they didn't fit the new aesthetic. How many generals and admirals have you fired? Moulton asked. The question was soft, almost conversational, which made it all the more terrifying. Hegseth froze. This was the danger zone. This was the topic he had been dreading. The purge. He had sold it to the base as a necessary cleaning of the house, a removal of the rot. But in this room, under oath, rot had to be defined. Reasons had to be given. Hegseth stalled, his eyes shifting. I don't know the exact number, but you don't know the number, Moulton repeated, incredulous. It's 8. 8. 8 careers. 8 lifetimes of service. 8 families uprooted. And the man who swung the axe couldn't even be bothered to remember the body count. Can you explain why any of them were fired? Moulton asked. Like, just explain why. Why was the Army JAG fired? Why did you fire him? The Army Judge Advocate General, the top lawyer in the Army. You don't fire the top lawyer unless he did something illegal or unless he refused to do something illegal for you. Hegseth stiffened. His jaw set. He retreated once again to his favorite fortress. They all serve at the pleasure of the president, Hegseth recited, the words sounding even more hollow than before. And I think, Hegseth tried to pivot. No, I'm just asking you why, Moulton interjected. He wasn't going to let him speechify. General Kane is a great example of that. I'm just asking why we need. Moulton leaned forward. You probably learned at Princeton what why means. The mention of Princeton hit Hegseth like a physical slap. It was a reminder of his own elite background, the very background he pretended to disdain when he was playing the populist on TV. It was Moulton saying, I know who you are. I know where you came from. Stop playing dumb. Why did you fire him? Moulton demanded. They serve at the pleasure of the president, Hegseth repeated, his voice rising, becoming brittle. And we want better representation in each and every of those. You can't explain why you fired any of them, Moulton concluded. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. The timer on the dais beeped. The red light flashed. Moulton's time was up, but the damage was done. In 5 minutes, he had stripped the Secretary of Defense naked. He had revealed a man who mishandled classified intel, wasted $1 billion for zero strategic gain, and fired generals without cause, hiding behind the president's skirts whenever the questions got too hard. "Gentlemen's time has expired," the chairman announced, banging the gavel. But the echo of the gavel didn't end the scene. It merely punctuated the tragedy. Moulton gathered his papers. He didn't look triumphant. He looked sad. He looked at Hegseth one last time, a man who had everything: the suit, the title, the power, the president's ear. Everything except the one thing that actually mattered in that room: honor. As the cameras panned away and the pundits started their chatter, Moulton knew the real story wasn't about the text message. It was about the silence. The silence of the generals who were gone. The silence of the ships that weren't there. And the deafening silence of a man who demanded accountability from everyone but himself. The hearing room felt less like a legislative chamber and more like a surgical theater where a biopsy was being performed on a dying organ. The organ in question was the concept of impartiality in the American military. Seth Moulton watched Pete Hegseth regain his composure. The secretary had taken a sip of water, his hand trembling imperceptibly, a tremor not of fear, perhaps, but of suppressed rage. He had been embarrassed on the technicals, signal. He had been humiliated on the strategy, the Red Sea, and now Moulton was coming for his ideology. The transcript would show a simple question: why was the Army JAG fired? But in the cinematic reality of the moment, it was a grenade tossed into a crowded bunker. The Army Judge Advocate General, the JAG, the conscience of the Army, the person whose sole job is to tell a commander, "No, sir, you cannot do that. That is illegal. That is a war crime. That violates the UCMJ." To fire a combat commander might be a dispute over tactics. To fire the head of logistics might be about efficiency. But to fire the top lawyer without explanation, that sends a signal that echoes in every barracks from Fort Bragg to Camp Pendleton. The law is no longer the highest authority here. Loyalty is. Moulton leaned into the microphone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The gravity of the implication did the heavy lifting. "Can you explain why any of them were fired?" Moulton asked, his tone deceptively gentle, almost curious. "Like, just explain why. Why was the Army JAG fired? Why did you fire him?" Hegseth's eyes hardened. He knew this trap. If he gave a specific reason, he disagreed with me on policy, he would be admitting to politicizing the officer corps. If he said misconduct, he would have to prove it. And there was no proof. So he returned to the only safe harbor he had left: the monarch's defense. "They all serve at the pleasure of the president," Hegseth intoned. It was a mantra now, a shield of words. But Moulton saw it for what it was: a confession of weakness. A strong leader explains his decisions. A weak leader hides behind his boss. And I think Hegseth started to ramble, trying to fill the dead air with patriotic noise. "No, I'm just asking you why." Moulton cut him off. Sharp, precise, like a drill instructor correcting a recruit. General Kane is a great example of that. Moulton paused, letting the name hang in the air. General Kane, a man with decades of service. A man who had probably eaten more MREs in the dirt than Hegseth had eaten steak dinners in D.C. Gone. Erased. And for what? Hegseth shifted. He looked annoyed that the pleasure of the president line wasn't working. It was supposed to be the ultimate trump card. Why was this congressman still asking? "I'm just asking why we need." Moulton started, then stopped. He looked at Hegseth with a piercing gaze, one that stripped away the Fox News makeup and the tailored suit. He decided to get personal. Not petty, but personal in a way that exposed the intellectual dishonesty on display. "You probably learned at Princeton what why means," Moulton said. The room gasped inwardly. It was a subtle, brutal knife twist. Hegseth's brand was built on being the anti-elite. He sold himself as the voice of the grunt, the outsider fighting the Ivy League establishment. But here was Moulton, a Harvard man, reminding everyone that Hegseth was one of them. Princeton, the Ivy League, the very establishment he claimed to despise. It was a masterful deconstruction of the character Hegseth played on TV. "You aren't a blue-collar hero, Pete. You're a Princeton grad playing dress-up. You know logic. You know reason. So stop pretending you don't understand the question." Hegseth's jaw clenched. The reference to his education was a breach of the unspoken protocol of Washington masquerades. He hated it. Why did you fire him? Moulton repeated, relentless. They serve at the pleasure of the president, Hegseth said again, but this time his voice was tighter, higher. The mask was slipping. And we want better representation in each and every of those. Better representation. Moulton's mind raced. What does better representation mean in the context of a judge advocate general? Does it mean a lawyer who interprets the law better? Or does it mean a lawyer who represents the political will of the White House better? In a democracy, the military represents the Constitution. In a regime, the military represents the party. Hegseth's slip of the tongue, better representation, was a terrifying glimpse into the future he was building. A military where officers are chosen not for their competence or their fidelity to the law, but for how well they represent the specific ideology of the current administration. Moulton didn't let the moment pass. He looked at a row of military aides sitting behind Hegseth. Majors, colonels, lieutenant commanders. They sat stone-faced, staring straight ahead, their uniforms pressed, their ribbons perfectly aligned. But Moulton knew what they were thinking. They were the survivors. They were watching their boss, a civilian appointee, justify the decapitation of their leadership with vague platitudes about representation. They knew that if they made a mistake on a classified text, they would be court-martialed. They knew that if they failed a mission, they would be relieved of command. But they were watching a man who did both, and who claimed that his only judge was the pleasure of the president. This was the Hypocrisy Doctrine. It wasn't just about double standards. It was about the destruction of the meritocracy. The military, for all its flaws, is built on the idea that performance matters, that rules matter, that the rank on your collar is earned through blood, sweat, and competence. Hegseth was dismantling that. He was replacing merit with favor. You can't explain why you fired any of them, Moulton said. His voice was filled with a profound disappointment. Not anger anymore, just a deep, resonant sadness for the institution he loved. The clock ticked down. The red light flashed. But the scene didn't end with the gavel. It ended in the minds of the viewers. Moulton had successfully painted a picture of a Defense Department in chaos. He had connected the dots. The carelessness, the signal texts. A leader who is sloppy with secrets. The incompetence, the Red Sea failure. A leader who wastes billions for zero results. The tyranny, the firing of the generals. A leader who purges independent thought and replaces it with loyalists. The hypocrisy, the refusal to accept accountability while demanding it from others. As the chairman called time, Moulton closed his folder. He didn't slam it. He closed it with the finality of a coroner closing a body bag. The camera lingered on Hegseth. He forced a smile for the person next to him, but his eyes were empty. He had survived the hearing, but he had lost the argument. He had kept his job, but he had lost his authority. In the hallway outside, the press would be waiting. They would ask about the sound bites. They would ask about the Princeton jab. But inside Moulton's head, the only thing that echoed was the silence of those 8 fired officers. The silence of the men and women who had been removed to make way for better representation. Moulton stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Hegseth one last time. You think you've won? Pete, Moulton thought. You think because you have the office, you have the power. But power without principle is just noise. And eventually, the noise stops. He walked out of the hearing room, leaving the showman alone on his stage, surrounded by the wreckage of his own answers. The lights of the hearing room seemed to dim, casting long shadows over the witness table. The Great Seal of the United States hung on the wall, a silent observer to the erosion of the very values it represented. The Hypocrisy Doctrine had been unveiled. And for anyone paying attention, for anyone who truly cared about the Republic, it was a terrifying sight to behold. The gavel struck the sounding block, a sharp, wooden punctuation mark that signaled the end of the hearing. But for Seth Moulton, it felt less like an ending and more like the closing of a coffin lid. The committee stands adjourned. The room instantly dissolved into chaos. The spell of the interrogation was broken. The aides, previously frozen like statues behind their bosses, sprang into frantic motion, gathering papers, whispering into phones, and shielding their principals from the sudden onslaught of the press. Moulton didn't move immediately. He remained seated, his hands resting on the dossier that contained the autopsy report of Pete Hegseth's leadership. He watched the Secretary of Defense rise. Hegseth moved with the practiced ease of a celebrity leaving a talk show. The tension that had gripped him moments ago, the sweat on the lip, the darting eyes, vanished as soon as the red-on-air light of the committee room blinked off. He buttoned his suit jacket, shot a dazzling, teeth-baring smile at a friendly reporter from OANN who was waving for his attention, and clapped a hand on the shoulder of a junior aide. "Look at him," Moulton thought, a wave of nausea rolling through him. He thinks he won. He thinks because he didn't get arrested, he won. It was the ultimate disconnect. To Hegseth, this was theater. It was about surviving the clip, getting the soundbite, and feeding the base. To Moulton, it was about the sanctity of the chain of command. Moulton stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the last hour settling in his bones. He packed his papers methodically. The transcript of the signal texts, the cost analysis of the Red Sea failure, $1 billion burnt for zero commercial transit, the list of the 8 fired officers. He walked out of the hearing room, pushing through the heavy oak doors into the hallway where the real circus began. The hallway was a gauntlet of microphones and cameras. "Secretary Hegseth, Secretary Hegseth, did you text classified info?" "Mr. Secretary, what about the JAG officer?" Moulton watched from the periphery as Hegseth stopped. The secretary didn't hide. He walked right into the cluster of cameras. He loved the lens. It was his oxygen. "Listen," Hegseth said, his voice projecting that confident, deep baritone that had made him a star on Fox. "The Democrats want to talk about process. They want to talk about paperwork. I'm here to talk about winning. We are restoring lethality to the force. We're cleaning house. And if breaking a few bureaucratic eggs is what it takes to make the omelet of victory, then so be it." The reporters scribbled furiously. It was a good line. The omelet of victory. It meant nothing, of course. You don't win wars by texting launch times on insecure apps. You don't restore lethality by firing your top lawyers. But it sounded good. Moulton walked past the scrum, head down, moving towards the quiet of the elevators. He didn't want to engage in the shouting match. He wanted to think. As the elevator doors closed, shutting out the noise of the showman, Moulton found himself alone with his reflection in the polished steel doors. The purge, he thought. That's what this is really about. The 8 generals and admirals. Hegseth had dismissed them with a wave of his hand. They serve at the pleasure of the president. But the subtext was terrifying. By firing the Army JAG, the guardian of military law, without cause, Hegseth wasn't just removing a person. He was removing a barrier. He was removing the no. Every dictator, every authoritarian in history starts by removing the people who know the rules. You fire the auditors. You fire the inspectors. You fire the lawyers who say, "Sir, that's illegal." And you replace them with people who say, "Yes, sir. Right away, sir. Whatever you say, sir." Hegseth had admitted it, almost accidentally, with that slip about better representation. He didn't want officers who represented the Constitution. He wanted officers who represented him. The elevator dinged. Moulton stepped out into the quiet corridor of the office building. The contrast was jarring. Downstairs, it was noise and lights. Upstairs, it was the silent machinery of governance. He walked into his office, tossing the dossier onto his desk. It landed with a heavy thud. The true verdict of today's hearing wouldn't be delivered by the committee chairman. It wouldn't be delivered by the press. It would be delivered in the future on a battlefield that hadn't been chosen yet. Moulton walked to the window, looking out at the Capitol dome shining in the distance. He thought about the young officers watching that hearing today. The lieutenants at West Point. The captains at Quantico. What lesson had they just learned? They learned that if you are a grunt, accountability is a hammer that crushes you. If you bring your phone into a SCJF, you go to jail. If you fail a mission, you get relieved. But if you're the Secretary of Defense, if you're the man at the very top, accountability is a joke. It's a partisan witch hunt. It's something you deflect with a smile and a reference to your Ivy League education. The same education you pretend to mock. Hegseth had successfully established a two-tiered system of justice, one for the soldiers and one for the courtiers. "He's dangerous," Moulton whispered to the empty room. It wasn't the danger of a mastermind. It was the danger of a child playing with a loaded weapon. Hegseth didn't respect the classification system because he didn't understand the value of secrets. He didn't respect the generals because he didn't understand the value of independent counsel. He only understood loyalty and optics. The signal texts were just the smoke. The fire was the systematic dismantling of the professional, nonpartisan military. Moulton sat down at his desk. He picked up a pen. He had to write a statement for his constituents. He had to explain why this mattered. He started to write. "Today, we saw the face of the new Pentagon. It is a face that smiles while it breaks the rules. It is a leadership that demands absolute discipline from the ranks while practicing absolute recklessness at the top." He paused. The image of the Red Sea came back to him. 0 ships. $1 billion. We are spending a fortune to defend a strategy that isn't working, led by a man who cannot even defend his own phone. But the cost isn't just in dollars. The cost is in trust. Trust. That was the currency of the military. When a soldier follows an order to charge a hill, they do it because they trust the chain of command. They trust that the order is lawful, that the intelligence is sound, and that their lives are not being thrown away for a publicity stunt. Hegseth was eroding that trust. He was turning the Pentagon into another branch of the campaign headquarters. Moulton put the pen down. The fatigue was overwhelming now. It was the exhaustion of a man trying to hold up a wall that everyone else seemed content to let fall. The Princeton jab. He knew it had stung Hegseth. Why? Because it pierced the populist veil. It reminded everyone that Pete Hegseth wasn't just one of the guys. He was an elite who had chosen to play a character. And that character was now in charge of the nuclear codes. The verdict was clear, at least to Moulton. Pete Hegseth was not a Secretary of Defense. He was a demolition man. He was there to tear down the institutions, to purge the experts, and to build a Praetorian Guard loyal only to the pleasure of the president. And the terrifying part? He was getting away with it. Moulton looked at the TV screen in the corner of his office. It was muted, but he could see the cheering on Fox News. Hegseth slams woke generals in fiery hearing. The narrative was already being rewritten. The technical failure was being spun as moral courage. The incompetence was being spun as disruption. Moulton turned off the TV. The screen went black. "Silence," he muttered. The silence of the room matched the silence of the 8 fired generals. It matched the silence of the empty shipping lanes in the Red Sea. It was the silence of a democracy holding its breath, waiting to see if the rules still mattered. Moulton stood up and walked to the door. He had more work to do. The hearing was over, but the war for the soul of the military had just begun. He would keep asking the questions. He would keep demanding the records. He would keep pointing out the hypocrisy. Because if he didn't, who would? He turned off the lights in his office, leaving the room in darkness, save for the faint glow of the streetlights outside illuminating the dossier on his desk. The word accountability was visible on the cover, a bold promise that felt, in that moment, like a fading memory. The silent warrior walked out into the night, leaving the showman to his applause. But as every soldier knows, the applause eventually stops. And when it does, all that's left is the reality of what you've done. And the reality was the guardrails were gone.